I want to tell you about the radio. Specifically, my radio. The specific Zenith console radio in my living room, a Zenith Model 7H820, if you want the specifics, which you probably don't, but which I am including because the specifics are the point of this series. The wood cabinet, the fabric-covered speaker, the dial with its stations marked in kilocycles, the on-off knob that has the specific resistance of something used thousands of times. I bought it in 1940. I turn it on in the morning when I get up. I leave it on while I make coffee and eat breakfast. I sometimes leave it on when I leave the apartment because I forgot to turn it off. I turn it on again in the evening. I fall asleep sometimes with it on. The radio has been part of my mornings and evenings for 8 years. I have not thought about it once in 8 years. This week, because of this series, I thought about it. What I found surprised me. I want to describe what the radio is before I describe what it does, because the what it is remarkable, and I have been taking it entirely for granted. Radio waves. Electromagnetic waves, the same family of phenomena as light, but at a different frequency, longer wavelengths, lower energy, able to travel through the air, through walls, through the body, through almost anything at the speed of light. A radio transmitter converts sound, the voice of the announcer, the music from the band, into a radio wave. It broadcasts that wave outward in all directions simultaneously, at the speed of light, from the antenna of the broadcast tower. The wave travels through the air. It passes through the walls of my building. It passes through the walls of my apartment. It enters my radio's antenna. My radio converts the wave back into sound. The announcer's voice, which was in a studio on West 52nd Street at 9 in the morning, arrives in my living room on West 54th Street at 9 in the morning. The distance? Approximately 2 city blocks. The travel time? A fraction of a second so small that no instrument I know of can measure it. 2 city blocks in no measurable time. This is the magic trick that we call the radio. Before the radio, sound was local. If you wanted to hear music, the music had to be in the same room as you. The musician, or the gramophone playing a recording of the musician, had to be physically present in your acoustic vicinity. If you wanted to hear the news, someone who had read the news had to tell it to you, or you had to read the newspaper yourself. If you wanted to hear a speech, you had to be in the room where the speech was given, or you read it afterward in the newspaper, which is not the same thing as hearing it. Sound required proximity. The gramophone changed this for recorded music. I described the gramophone in the First Time series, in the Sinatra episode, as the technology that brought music into the room. The gramophone carries the sound of a specific performance, recorded at a specific time, and plays it back wherever the gramophone is. But the gramophone carries the past. The gramophone plays what was recorded. The radio carries the present. The radio plays what is happening, right now, as I listen. The voice on the radio is speaking those words at this moment. The music on the radio is being played at this moment, not recorded, live, happening in the world, somewhere in the city or across the country or across the ocean, and simultaneously in my living room. The radio brought the present tense of the world into my apartment. I turn the radio on at approximately 7 in the morning, not because I have decided to listen to the radio, because it is what I do when I get up. The radio is part of the morning the way the coffee is part of the morning. Automatic, undeliberated, the specific ritual of the waking up that has become so habitual that departing from it would feel strange. On Tuesday this week, I turned the radio on, and then I listened to it. Not in the usual way. The usual way is, the radio is on, I am making coffee, the radio is in the background, I am not fully listening. Listening while doing other things, the specific divided attention of the radio as background. This week, I sat down. I looked at the radio. I listened. What was on the radio at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in October? The news. A man's voice, the specific announcer voice that radio has developed. A voice calibrated for clarity and authority, slightly different from any person's natural speaking voice. The radio voice that announces rather than speaks. He described events. The news of the day. A labor dispute, the election, international developments, a fire in Brooklyn that had injured several people. Then, music. A band, big band, something I could identify as Glenn Miller adjacent without knowing if it was actually Glenn Miller. The specific full orchestral sound that the AM radio carries, not the full fidelity of a live performance, the specific radio sound, slightly compressed, slightly bright. The sound that is the sound of radio and not the sound of music. Then, an advertisement. Then, more news. Then, another advertisement. The morning passed. I sat and listened for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of radio at 7 in the morning. News, music, advertisements. News, music, advertisements. The pattern. I have been thinking about the radio as a guest. Not a human guest, a presence in the room. Something that takes up acoustic space, that fills silence, that makes the apartment feel occupied when the apartment might otherwise feel empty. The radio is the most common solution to the problem of living alone. Not the only solution. Books, work, the gramophone. But the radio is the solution that is always available and that requires nothing from you. You do not have to choose what to read. You do not have to choose what record to put on. You turn the dial and the radio presents something and you receive it. The radio is the uninvited guest. I say uninvited not as a complaint. I invited it in 1940 when I bought it, and I re-invite it every morning when I turn it on. But uninvited in the sense of, the radio does not ask what you want before it gives you what it has. The radio presents its program, and you receive it or you don't. This is different from the gramophone. The gramophone plays what you choose. The radio plays what it broadcasts. You receive what is offered. I have been thinking about whether this is good or bad, and I have arrived at, it is different. When I choose the gramophone record, I am choosing my mood. I know what is coming. I have selected it because I want it now. When I turn on the radio, I receive what the radio has, which may be what I want, and may not be what I want, and is in any case what is there. The radio as surprise. The radio as, someone else decided, and here it is. This is the thing about the radio that I have been sitting with all week. The radio is the first technology that put the public world inside the private room, simultaneously with the public world happening. Before the radio, the private room was private in the acoustic sense. What happened in the room was the room's sound. What happened outside the room was outside the room. The newspaper brought public information into the private room, but as text, as delayed text, as the reporting of what happened yesterday or this morning. The radio brings the public world into the private room in real time. FDR's fireside chats. The President of the United States in my living room, speaking to me specifically, addressing me as a citizen, as a person who is in this together with him, as a member of the public that he is addressing. He was in my living room, not his voice recorded, his voice live at the moment he was speaking, in my room simultaneously with being in every other room that had a radio turned on. Millions of living rooms simultaneously receiving the same voice, each living room private, each living room hosting the same public event, the private room and the public event occupying the same space at the same time. This had never happened before the radio. I want to say something specific about FDR and the radio, because it is the clearest example of what the radio as a political technology made possible. Franklin Roosevelt understood something about the radio that no previous president had needed to understand, because no previous president had the radio. He understood. The radio is intimate. The newspaper is public. The speech in a hall is public. The proclamation is public. These forms of communication are directed at the public as a mass, at citizens, at voters, at the body politic. The radio enters a private room. When FDR sat in front of the microphone and said, "My friends," those two words, which he used to open his fireside chats, he was using the specific mode of address appropriate to the medium. Not fellow Americans, the formal public address. My friends. The address to someone who is known, who is trusted, who is in the same room. He was not in the same room, but the radio made it feel like he was. And feel like he was is not nothing. The specific quality of intimacy that the radio produces, the voice in the ear, in the private space, changes the relationship between the speaker and the listener, makes the speaker feel closer, makes the message feel more personal. FDR understood this. He used it to talk the country through the Depression and then through the war. 70 million people listened to some of the fireside chats. 70 million private rooms. One voice. I want to say what FDR understood, and I want to say what else the same understanding made possible, because honesty requires saying both. The radio is intimate. The radio bypasses the distance of the public address. The radio puts a voice in the private room, and the voice feels like someone who knows you. FDR used this to hold a country together in crisis. Others used it differently. The device showed me, and I found more in my own reading, the specific relationship between radio and the political movements of the 1930s and 1940s that were not FDR. The radio was not politically neutral. The radio was a weapon, used by anyone who understood its power. Father Coughlin, the radio priest, the Catholic priest whose radio broadcasts in the 1930s reached perhaps 30 million listeners, whose broadcasts moved from populism to anti-Semitism, whose voice was in 30 million living rooms, saying things that the living rooms received in the intimate mode of the radio guest. The intimate mode. My friend, let me tell you the truth. The truth, in his case, was not the truth. The radio cannot distinguish. The radio delivers the lie with the same intimacy as the truth. The specific power of the radio is, it makes the speaker feel trustworthy by being present in your room. Trustworthiness and presence are not the same thing. The radio makes them feel the same. This is the radio's gift. This is the radio's danger. I want to come back to something lighter. Sunday morning. I turned the radio on at 9. What was playing? Jazz. I did not catch the station identification. I did not know who was playing. A quartet. Piano, bass, drums, trumpet. The specific quality of a live radio broadcast from a club or a recording studio. The ambient sound of the space just audible underneath the music. A musician in New Orleans, or in New York, or in Chicago, I did not know, was playing. He was playing at 9 on Sunday morning. He did not know he was playing in my living room. He was playing for the radio, which carries sound to wherever there is a receiver, which means he was playing for everyone who happened to have their radio on at that moment, tuned to that frequency, receiving his playing in their rooms. He was in my room. Without knowing it, I listened to the full piece, approximately 8 minutes. I did not do anything else. I sat and listened the way I sat and listened at the oyster bar, the way I sat at the automat and watched. 8 minutes of a musician I did not know, playing from wherever he was, arriving in my living room via the physics of electromagnetic waves. This is ordinary. This happens every morning when I turn on the radio. I had stopped noticing. This week, I noticed. The radio solves a specific form of loneliness, not the deep loneliness, the loneliness of not being known, of not having people who matter to you, of the absence of connection. This the radio cannot touch. The surface loneliness, the specific discomfort of the empty room, the silence of an apartment with one person in it who is moving through the morning, making coffee, eating breakfast, going about the beginning of the day in a space that has no other human sound in it. The radio fills this. The voice, the music, the presence of sound that has human origin, that came from a person, was made by a person, is arriving from a person. Not a person who knows you, not a person who cares about your specific morning, but a human presence, acoustically, in the room. This is not nothing. I have turned on the radio on mornings when I particularly did not want the silence, when the week had been hard, when the apartment felt particularly mine and no one else's. I turned on the radio and the sound came in, and the room was less empty. The radio is the solution to surface loneliness, and the radio cannot solve the loneliness it is solving. The voice on the radio does not know I am listening. The musician playing at 9 on Sunday does not know I am sitting on the floor of my living room listening. The president in the fireside chat does not know I am in my specific living room receiving his words. The intimacy of the radio is real on my side. It is not mutual. The radio speaks to everyone simultaneously. It is personal to no one. I am the specific person receiving the general transmission. This is a form of connection. It is not the form of connection that ends loneliness. I described the advertisement in episode 11 of First Times. I described it in the context of the jingle, the specific intrusion into involuntary memory that the jingle produces, the way advertising places things in your head without asking. The radio advertisement is the jingle's home. Before the radio, advertising was something you saw. The newspaper advertisement, the billboard, the shop sign. Visual. You had to look at it. You could look away. The radio advertisement is something you hear, in your living room, while you are doing something else. You cannot look away from sound the way you can look away from an image. Sound enters you without your active participation. The radio advertisement enters your living room when you have the radio on and plays whether you want it to or not. You can turn the radio off, you can change the station, but if you want the radio, if you want the music and the news and the voice in the room, you get the advertisement with it. This is the deal. The radio is free. The advertisement is the price. And the advertisement, arriving in your living room in the intimate mode of the radio guest, has the specific effectiveness of something that feels personal. Are you tired of, says the advertisement voice, using the second person, using you? Are you tired of? Yes, often. The advertisement knows. I want to describe what AM radio sounds like because it is a specific sound, and I have been listening to it for 8 years without listening to it. The AM radio sound. Warm, slightly compressed, the high frequencies somewhat attenuated, the mid-range prominent. It is not the sound of the room where the music was played. It is the sound of the music after it has been converted to a radio wave and converted back, a transformation that takes something from it and adds something else. What it takes. Some of the full fidelity, the very high frequencies, some of the spatial quality of live sound. What it adds, a specific warmth, a presence. The specific quality of radio sound that is recognizable as radio sound, that is not quite the sound of anything else. I can tell when something is being broadcast on the radio versus when I am hearing a gramophone record. Not because I know the station, because of the sound quality. Because the radio has its own acoustic character. The radio voice. The announcers speak in a specific register, a slightly elevated diction, the words enunciated with the care of someone who knows that diction is crucial when the listener cannot also see the speaker. This specific voice, the radio voice, is a voice that did not exist before the radio. It is a voice trained by and for the medium. It sounds like authority, clarity, the public world entering your private room in its best suit. The radio voice and I have been in my apartment together every morning for 8 years. It is familiar. It does not know me. I want to say something about the radio and the war. December 7th, 1941. I was in my apartment. The radio was on. A Sunday. I often had the radio on Sunday mornings. The music was interrupted by an announcement. The words arrived in my living room. Pearl Harbor. The specific way I learned that the United States had entered the war. Through the radio, in my living room on a Sunday morning, while whatever I was doing before the announcement became irrelevant. Before the radio, news of this kind traveled through the newspaper, through word of mouth, through the specific human chain of communication that had served civilizations for millennia. The news was hours or days old by the time it reached most people. With the radio, the news of Pearl Harbor reached people within hours of the attack. Not instantly. There was reporting time, communication time, the specific lag between the event and the broadcast. But within the same day, within the time when the shock was still the shock. I sat in my apartment and listened. I was alone. Millions of people were in their living rooms, alone or with their families, receiving the same words. The radio made this collective moment private, and private moments collective simultaneously. The most public event of the decade arrived in my specific private room on a Sunday morning. I have never forgotten where I was. The radio made sure I was somewhere specific to remember. The device showed me what happens to the radio. The radio continues. Not unchanged, the device showed that the radio evolves. FM radio, which is already beginning to develop in 1948, produces a cleaner, higher fidelity sound than AM. Music on FM sounds more like music and less like the specific AM radio sound that I described. The radio does not disappear, which I find reassuring. The gramophone was not killed by the radio. The radio is not killed by television, though television takes some of what the radio does and adds pictures to it. The radio persists. By 2026, the radio is still there. AM and FM stations still broadcast. People listen in cars, the car radio, which is its own specific culture. People listen at work, and something called podcasting. A podcast. A radio program that is not broadcast, but stored digitally and available whenever the listener chooses. The radio program freed from the schedule. The program that you can listen to at 9 on Tuesday evening if you want. Not at 9 on Tuesday morning when it broadcasts. The radio without the broadcast time. The radio on demand. This is, I thought about this when I read it in the device, the radio's specific quality, the one that made FDR's fireside chats what they were, is it arrives at the same moment to everyone. The simultaneity. The million living rooms receiving the same words at the same time. The podcast removes the simultaneity. Everyone listens at their own time. The collective experience becomes individual. Whether this is better, different. The radio as collective experience is specific and valuable. The podcast as personal experience is specific and valuable. Different. Both are voices in your room. I want to end with something honest. I sometimes leave the radio on when I leave the apartment. I told myself, for 8 years, that this was because I forgot to turn it off. This week, thinking about the radio, I realized I don't always forget. Sometimes I leave it on deliberately, without fully admitting to myself that I am doing so deliberately. I leave it on because when I come home, the apartment sounds occupied. Not because I am afraid of burglars. If a burglar was deterred by a radio, the deterrence is incidental. I leave it on because the sound of the radio in the apartment when I open the door is the sound of a room that has been active in my absence. The radio has been talking to the empty room. The room has received the words. The apartment does not feel abandoned when I come home to the radio. The radio has kept it company. I am aware of how this sounds, the radio as company for the furniture. The radio broadcasting into an empty room for 3 hours while I was at rehearsal. And yet, when I open the door and the radio is on, the apartment feels more like itself, more inhabited, more mine. The radio playing to the empty room is me leaving a part of my morning in the apartment, while the rest of me goes out. This is what 8 years of turning the radio on in the morning produces. The radio is not a guest anymore. The radio is the background of the room. The background I chose. The background that chose me back. There is a dial on the radio, the dial that you turn to move between stations. The specific arc of the dial, marked with numbers, 550 kilocycles, 660, 710, 770, 880, 1010, up through the AM band. Each number a frequency, each frequency a voice, each voice coming from somewhere in the city or beyond. When I turn the dial, I am not choosing a station. I am choosing what world enters my room. This station, the news of New York. This station, jazz from a club somewhere. This station, a drama being broadcast live, actors in a studio performing a play that arrives in my room as voices without faces, as sound without image, as theater for one person alone in the evening. The dial is the most democratic device I own, not in the political sense, in the sense of equal access to all stations, all frequencies, all the worlds that are being broadcast. The jazz is not more expensive than the news. The news is not more available than the drama. I turn the dial and I have them all. I turn the dial and the world enters. Whatever world I choose, for as long as I choose it. And when I want silence, I turn the dial to off. The world goes out. The room is mine again. For now. Come back for the next episode. The vacuum cleaner. The machine that changed the poniedziałek, the Monday. The machine that replaced the beating of rugs with the sucking of dust. The machine that made cleanliness automatic and that made the question of cleanliness complicated in a new way. Come back.